metal and dual reproduction. Mathibela is also an associate at Nawe Collective, an archivist at the Center for the Study of Race, Class, and Gender at the University of Johannesburg. She's a co-parent at the Ways of Repairs Artistic Research Residency, and she works with and responds to sound archives, including music, vinyl, cassettes, CDs, field recordings, audio interviews, voices, noise, and silence as cultural text. So these are the profiles of the speakers that we have today. And as you can tell, they are all very multifaceted beings who have dabbled in both liberation, using their, artistic ways to advance the liberation. So I feel like there's no better person to have this conversation. Just to remind you, we're having this conversation, and this objective is to explore the role of culture, of art, literature, music, and knowledge systems in perpetuating colonial oppression, and our right and duty to assess, dismantle, rebuild, reimagine, and speak of new liberated futures. Before we get into the conversation, I want to just mention some housekeeping rules to make us have a good conversation that is smooth. First, please mute your microphones if you're not speaking, and share any questions and reflections that you have in the chat. Someone from the Liberation Alliance team will be, taking down your questions and making sure that they are discussed. And then also you can follow Liberation Alliance on all social media platforms to stay connected during the upcoming, sessions when we speak of new things. I think this is a wonderful series, and yes, I need everybody to get on it. So I just want to briefly give an introduction on why we are basically having this conversation. So first of all, documenting and engaging cultural truth and artistic expression is sacrosanct to the process of liberation. From the Toi Toi protest dance in South Africa, which has roots in the military drills of the Algerian liberation movement, to the Medu Art Ensemble and the music of Fela Kuti, Maria Makeba, Hugh Masekela, and other African revolutionaries, liberatory imaginaries grounded in African indigeneity, histories, cultures, technologies, and experiences hold importance in liberation movements. Basically, art has been quite crucial in advancing our liberation struggles through song, through novels, and oral stories, through painting. Even our masks, our African masks that are in British museums, are a testament to the the colonial presence on this continent and what it has robbed us of. And it's also testament to the brilliance of our ancestors and that basically the genius of this continent that is often buried. So I think that we need indeed to explore questions on how, first of all, we can continue to use culture and art in our contemporary liberation movements. We need to also know how it is being weaponized, perhaps within the liberation movements or outside, how the colonial establishments are also weaponizing art and or artistic erasure, cultural erasure, or cultural diversion, artistic diversion to meet their own ends of colonizing and dominating us as a continent and as a people. So to get into we're going to get into the questions. I'm going to request that a member from the Liberation Alliance team times this conversation so that we can have like ample time for discussion and interaction outside of answering the questions. So maybe when we have gone for 30 minutes, please let me know. So the first question, I think before we get into it, let me just let our speakers also say something, introduce themselves, or maybe they'll introduce themselves as they answer the question. So the first question that I want us to explore together is drawing from examples such as the restriction of the Batuku and Funana dance in Cape Verde during colonialism by the colonizer King Manuel I of Portugal, can we reflect on how colonial erosion, subjugation of culture, and artistic expression perpetuated coloniality, particularly of the mind? Uh, I'm requesting that this question is, we need to hear all perspectives. We need to hear a perspective from Sunshine and from you, Nombuso. So please take it away. I don't know who wants to go first. Nombuso, would you like to go first? You can introduce yourself and then, you know, get into the question.
Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you so much to Liberation Alliance Africa for this really wonderful conversation. I really love the framing of new things in the context of a conversation around culture. And that's also to say thank you to everyone who is here to think with us. And I just need to say that on my side, I don't know if I have the answers, but I do promise that a lot of some of these ideas that we're thinking about, some of these experiences and these ongoing questions in our heads and in our bodies around culture are things that I've been thinking about them a lot, and my views on them keep changing and keep moving. And for me, I think part of the question is always about like what do I think culture is, right? Like how do we define that? And I often like to say that to help me in my own thinking and so that I can be heard in terms of like my explanations of things, is that for me culture is so things like, as you know, like music, like literature, texts, poems, books, artworks, audio visual, like material. All of these things for me, I like to think of them as like manifestations of a culture, right? So for me, culture is more, it's more of an instinct, it's more of an ethic, a way of being that then influences what then gets produced as music, what gets produced as poetry, what then becomes the visual arts scene, right? And uh, part of the reading of culture in this way comes from having really looked at the ways in which anti-colonial liberation movements were mobilizing culture as an ethic to then produce a revolutionary kind of agenda. For instance, we had people like Cabral and Hamuka Cabral and Fanon who were saying that, in fact, the struggle itself, the struggle for an anti-colonial new world, is a cultural struggle. And they say this because they recognized that the colonial forces who then create coloniality and perpetuate coloniality understood that. So the banning of instruments like mbira in Zimbabwe, the banning of certain instruments and even sounds in the Brazilian, in the Afro-Brazilian tradition of samba, and the banning of specific drums in Southern Africa and in the Northwest, etc., under these particular under these very different moments of colonial rule, even though like the machinery of and the regime of the colonial state in its different pockets operates in very similar ways. We see this consistent banning of these instruments, these consistent bannings of these, these dances or these traditions. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the colonial states understood, and it still does understand in its new formation in the world right now, understood that these things that then become culture are actually informed by a very specific idea that these people know that they're human beings. They produce this music and they produce these dances, not because these things are merely aesthetic, but because they understand that they are human beings. And what are the ways in which we can demobilize that understanding, that embodied understanding that sits in their bodies when they dance, that sits in their production of music, that sits in their thoughts, in how they produce text, in how they think of orality. How do we disrupt that, right? The disruption is about those ethics of people knowing that they're human beings. It's not really about the instrument itself. It's not really about, we don't want people to dance, you know? We don't want them to dance because we know that in the moment of dance, they know that they are human being. That is that thing that's reinforced in their heads. It's reinforced in their minds. So I answered this question in this way to say that um, there's a particular understanding of culture that is completely removed from the products of culture, from the t-shirts, from the hats, from all of these things that we can see and touch and hear. And there is this persistent need nowadays where we are made to think of culture as the production of objects, the production of sound, the production of things like that, that look and feel a particular way, that make us, feel good, that make us remember and engage our memories in particular ways. But that's not always been the reason for what culture is, or even the reason why these instruments are taken away from certain groups or they're banned, why these dance groups are completely banned in some colonial environments, not just South Africa. You find the same thing in Tanzania, where certain practices that remind people of the background, that remind them that they actually do have traditions, they have a genealogy that is so separate from their current experience. That like that idea that the colonial like experience is not just happening in the physical like changes around people, i.e., they now have a very specific relationship to land that has now changed. They have a new specific relationship to labor that is now new, that is like coerced and enforced upon them. But at the same time, they have this background being not just an obsession pre-colonial Africa, but this background, which is a sensibility to who they are as human beings, and that actually we've always been human. We've known this for a long time. That's what the background is. Not necessarily that we want to go back to that time, but that we know how to organize our lives. We've always known that. And then things that are then objects are then used as cultural objects to then prevent people mentally from remembering and consistently remembering that they've always been human. They've always been human. They are human. And in fact, not just that they are human, they've always been at the forefront of deciding what it means to be human. They've always been at the forefront of socially producing every single day what it is to be human from their own very local, but also very global experience of like just being in the world. I hope that is not necessarily an answer, but an opening that makes sense.
No, you make a lot of sense, Nombuso. And as you were speaking, you made me personally realize that I just wrote something here that art is the evidence of our existence, our conscience, our consciousness, our values, the things we hold dear, the things that hurt. And it is such your analysis is so profound that I feel that when you talk about the commodification of like the removal, the way we are divorced from our cultural attachments or systems or creation, and then it's put outside of us as t-shirts and hats, and it's supposed to be the thing that makes us just comfortable, like makes us think that we still have we still have a culture, or that we still have autonomy or self-direction. Because for me, when I think of culture, I think of its root word cultivate, which is the cultivation of life. And most of us have been divorced from indeed the cultivation of life when it comes to our food systems, our where we sleep, how we work, and the only thing that they give us to um set, set, satiate us or satisfy us, I feel like we have something, it's just these little symbolic reductions of it, but the whole thing has been taken. I wonder what Sunshine thinks about this question, and even maybe a supplement to what you're saying. Sunshine, please.
Thank you, Mubeezi, and thank you, Nombuso. First, I would like to say that if my internet is choppy, I blame the government of Uganda. I've had unstable internet the whole week. Again, my name is Sunshine. I am an African feminist, and I work at Whose Knowledge, coordinating a campaign called Visible Wiki Women, which is at the intersection of filling gender gaps on women's representation on Wikipedia and the global internet, but the global encyclopedia, whatever it's called, whatever Wikipedia is called, and also interrogating why gaps on representation for Black, Brown, queer, trans women and non-binary folks, especially from majority of the world, exist not just in the internet, but in the world that we see. And I'm very excited to join this conversation. And I feel like some of my reflections about the first question have been shared, and I will add to that a little bit in the sense of, first of all, I'm very nervous to be having this conversation, but I was like, why am I nervous? I'm a consumer of art. I can talk about art and artistic things. And so when I was thinking about the first question, I was really reflecting on how art and artists remind us of our humanity and who we are before genocides, before pandemics, before all the intersecting oppressions, and beyond those oppressions. Art is how we think of ourselves, our liberations, our connections to our land, our connections to our ancestors. And it really is, when you think about it, an antithesis to the colonial project, in the sense that coloniality erases and invisibilizes us and our humanity. And I was thinking very specifically about the first time when I received this discussion guide to primitive, and also as a rehearsal for freedom, thinking really and connecting that to how coloniality then shows up in the ways we consume knowledge, and the things that are, especially within our education system, that are elevated or venerated as proper education. So there is a reason, if you go, for instance, to Makerere University, which is Uganda's largest public university, there is the course or the module around music, dance, and drama than the law school, which probably requires microphones to teach thousands of students, to churn out hundreds of non-critical thinkers. No shade to lawyers, but yes, shade to lawyers. And so I think that that is the function of coloniality, and just really thinking to continue to maintain our culture, to our traditions, but also to fund or to support the colonial capitalism project. Because if people are creating, which is what artists do, then they are not laboring, in factories, and they are not working to churn out products and produce and continue to produce for capitalism. And that's how we also see the shift that Nombuso was talking about around the functions of art, or the shift in the functions of artists and artistic expression, because now art is specifically for external audiences. When you think about writing or even literature from the African continent, for a long time, there's been conversations or critique about African writers writing for the white gaze, writing about poverty and disease and things that are very feed, again, the colonial project of erasing our full humanity. When you think about art moving from it being ritual to commercial in the ways in which one, states or public funds are not allocated to, creativity and programs around art and creativity, but also the way in which, to be an artist, for example, in our current context, you must have, the resources to have an exhibition and create, a degree of a brand, quote unquote. That movement from art as ritual, and also artistic expression to commercialization, and also really how then also that shows up in the ways in which our artistic consumption for us, our consumers, but also expression is mainly about erasing orality and also the domination of colonial languages. So for art to be mainstream or for art to be able to feed the artist, it must be reduced into, colonial languages. And so those are my initial reflections about that. I feel like I might have piggybacked off of some of the things that Nombuso was speaking, but those are what I was thinking about in reference to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sunshine. Those are really brilliant thoughts. Actually, your last point that you made reminded me of something that I saw in Kenya, in Karen, where there was, I think, a Maasai art shop, and it has like Maasai art shop on it. But when you speak to, of course, the Kenyans who know the history of that place, and for people who may not know, Karen is like named after a white woman who owned a lot of land in Kenya. And of course, that land used to be occupied by the Maasai. But now the Maasai, there is not a single Maasai in sight. In fact, you don't see any people because they are behind large fences. And when you were talking about, the point you were making last, Sunshine, you made me realize, think back on that time when I saw that little poster of like Maasai art, and I realized also that I think what, in answering this question, when you reflect on it, what colonialism does is to art is to, I think, erase the people and then reduce them to artifacts, like things to purchase and, like admire as goods, but the people themselves are away, who are like maybe the owners of the culture or the indigenous people. They're just reduced to like all their ways of life have been disrupted, and that's what has happened to most of us on the continent. I can see a warning of my internet connection, but I hope that people can still hear me. Let's go to the next question. And it pretty much ties into what we've been discussing, but just with a different twist. So it is commonly said that the role of art is to bear witness. So how have cultural expressions in literature, the arts, and knowledge systems historically reflected the times and also challenged systems of oppression? In what ways have our ancestors used art against the colonial establishment? In what ways have they used art to advocate for our liberation, to communicate the agenda of liberation? Whoever wants to go can go next. I don't know, Nombuso, maybe that you've had some time to rest your vocal cords, you can go next.
Okay. I actually want to answer that by kind of extending on what Senshan was talking about when the last parts around literature. For me, one of the examples, and it's just so great that particular moment came up, because one of the examples that I've been learning about in the last few months in my ongoing work of trying to understand the language question in Africa. In South Africa in particular, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you have a cohort in different generations of those times, a cohort of like African writers, early African writers, who are writing in local languages. They're like writing in isiZulu, Xhosa, Setswana, Sepedi, etc. These writers are literally creating publications, newspapers. They're writing books in local languages, in African languages, translating English texts into African languages into English texts themselves. And really what they're trying to do, or at least what I'm learning, is that in that early period of these African writers who are completely erased from African literature, conversations around African literature, for some reason, only starts with, the Makerere writers in the 60s, these guys and these human beings rather were really beginning to make sense of this new experience of being invaded, this new experience of having these people who came here who have now decided that they want to have a very different relationship, an exploitative relationship with the people that they find in this particular area. So you have this literature in this country that is now like almost 200 years old, of writers who started developing a language of how to respond to this situation through their own languages, trying to find the grammar, how to explain this new experience, how to explain the presence of Europeans, how to explain what modernity now means, European modernity, and also how to explain what African modernity will then mean for them. You have these moments where these people are trying to mobilize language to create a way of speaking through newspapers that are read by African readers, African writers writing for African readers and African audiences in the languages that they speak. So for me, this particular era in literature is one example of how Africans have been at the forefront of, actually, not even at the forefront, they've been ahead of the language debates for a very long time. But there's something about the ways in which we remember history, that certain parts of our histories become erased, not just even by the colonizers or colonial modernity itself, but also us ourselves as participants and makers of like that modernity, where you go to schools and English literature departments, and African literature literally starts with Chinua Achebe at a particular point, not taking into consideration that there's an entire vortex, an entire tradition before him and others that predates this debate whether the only way that we can write is if we write in English, and that we need to indigenize English. It is the only language of politics. And that's not to say that English should not be that, or any other colonial language should not be that. But the point is that we have a history in this continent of developing our own intellectual traditions and our own responses to colonial modernity in our own grammars, in our own languages. So the question is not whether we have done that before. The question is, how do we work with the existence of that type of archive as through a cultural practice? So for me, these writers were not only just witnessing what was happening to them, realizing the presence of these people, the presence of European history now, and trying to make sense of the presence of European history right next to their own histories, but they were also participants in defining what the new African is, but doing it through their own production of literature on their own terms of what literature is. But also, that's not to say that in this particular example, people were in total agreement. There was disagreements, when you look at some of these newspapers closely, and some of these organizers, intellectuals, you see the tensions. Some are saying, no, there are limits of writing in African languages. We need to take on English, to indigenize English, to cause English to also respond to our problems and use it as a way of communicating with one another, at least those of us in the Anglophone world. And some are saying, okay, we're not saying that that shouldn't be done, but that it shouldn't be an either or case, because we have a readership that has been developing over the last 100 years of Africans who are engaged in African stories, who are engaged in African newspapers for African solutions. Yeah, I think for me that's one example of people who are forging a path. And when I say people, it's really multiple generations, because it starts in the late 1800s and it goes all up until probably like the 50s, 60s, where you see this turn in this continent, where there's a very kind of seductive production of text in English, with the African Writers series developing, with certain really big figures in African literature also writing and choosing English as a medium of expression. And then only at some point, other people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o then come into this conversation, and they say, wait, there's an archive of people who have been writing in this continent in African languages, and some of his own preoccupations that then take up some of his later part of his life. The obsession with writing in African languages comes from his own observations of these early South African writers. So the beauty of all of this is that we see how different writers and different people who are active in literature over the years have taken seriously these lessons, have taken seriously the experience of all these disappearances that have happened in the last, I guess, 150 years now. So for me, I think that's the one example that's been floating in my head. I mean, I guess there are many others, but this one has been quite significant, because I've been finding myself in a space where I'm asking a lot of questions around language, and also recognizing that the questions that we have today around language are not the same questions that writers in the 60s or even writers in the 1900s or the late 1800s had. Our questions are very different, even though we do share, we have some common ground. Yeah.
Thank you, Nombuso. That's quite an insightful, in perspective, especially when you bring in talk about that generation of South African writers who are writing in, the local languages. It makes me want to know, because I know South Africa has many nations and that's many languages. I wonder what those writers were thinking about, how far did they want their message to go? Is it that maybe this is a question we can discuss later when we open the floor. Is it that when we try to communicate to everybody and thus take on the current lingua francas in each of our environments, like English, I don't know, French, is it that we want to speak to so many people and then we sort of lose out on an important aspect, which is the preservation, the growth of our languages? And perhaps maybe is it that we need then to be writing in our local languages, and then that information should go and be consumed deeply by our own nations, however small they are, but as long as a people is in consensus about whatever we are writing about, that's all that matters, because the problems are similar, they have different faces. Maybe, I don't know, it has got me thinking about that, because we all struggle, I think, about with those languages, the fact that even now we are using them to communicate, and of course at the expense of our own languages, which are really dying languages. Thank you so much for that perspective. I'd like us to actually explore it when we open the discussion. So I've taken note, I will ask that question. So Sunshine, do you have something to say about that? Do you have something to add on this question?
I just want to add, I'm going to talk about my grandmother because I saw a meme recently about how grandmothers didn't keep all these oral stories for us to come and start bashing audiobooks. So I want to talk about about my grandmother a little bit. So my grandmother is almost 86 years old. She's the love of my life, but she has early stage dementia, and so she's losing a lot of her memory. And one of the things that my grandmother has on her is like stories, because she has lived through so many of Uganda's political whatever government transitions and things like that. And one of the really one of the stories that she's told me that stands out is during the dictatorial regime of Idi Amin in Uganda. He would go to like villages and, you know, because met all this violence against women, but also source for wives. And so my grandmother used to hide when the president would be in a part of the world. My grandmother would hide my mom and my aunties and lock them up in a butchery. My grandfather had a butchery, so my grandmother would hide my mom and my aunties in a butchery until, you know, the president has left the place. And so I think a lot about how that story and some of the other stories that she's told about protecting her daughters from the violence of the state in the 1970s have remained untold, or have, well, she's told them to me and I'm repeating them now to a bunch of people, but they are not documented, but that doesn't take away their validity because of the way in which the knowledge has been transferred. And just really talking about, I was thinking around this question, all the books that I've read when I in literature class, all the books we read were for like Timothy Wangutsa, who is a Ugandan writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, of course, Kot Bitek, Peter Abrahams from South Africa. And rarely did I come across a writing, a piece of literature within our education system that was written or shared by a woman. And it's until I think we went on our own tangents of like looking for knowledge and books and literature that we came across all these incredible writers in Uganda, from Goret Jomhendo writing about the experiences of genocide, and many other Ugandan writers that now I can't name off head. But I also recently discovered Bessie Head, who is South African writer who used to write about you know, the oppressions of of apartheid and organizing, but also because she had to go to exile in Botswana. And I think about how all of that knowledge is not within curriculums of literature, and how that is not part of our understanding of liberation movements for people who do not seek knowledge outside of the classroom. And yeah, so that is my reflection about that. The orality of the knowledge and the knowledge systems that are not just, but also the absence and the erasure and invisibility of African women writers about liberation struggles, but also just our experiences, but just also just their experiences and the stories that they tell. Yeah.
I was talking while I was muted. Thank you, Sunshine, for sharing about your grandmother. Is there a chance to get her on like record for maybe like those an audio platform, so that we can like have those stories permanently, you know, stored somewhere where we can all access them? I think that would be great. When you are talking about like oral histories, I also thought about how much I have learned. I never used to really be a good student of literature, but not literature. I was the best student at literature. It's history somehow, because I guess of the way we were taught history, which was in a way as if it's like it does not matter and has nothing to do with our contemporary times. But one of the things that have really taught me histories about places has been music, and specifically music from South Africa. So Nombuso, referring to your region, I think that South Africa has such a rich tradition of music, and the songs are catchy. They are call and answer. Personally, I've listened to, I think, most of the South African protest songs. And because some of them are so wonderful, I want to know what they are about. I have been able to learn that these songs are on a variety of subjects. There is Peace Must Fall, there is Release Nelson Mandela, there are songs about the conditions in the mine in Johannesburg. There are songs about, the Boers and, what they were doing, taking the land. There are songs reclaiming land. There are songs talking about the police violence. There are songs for everything. And from just Googling lyrics or in Zosta, I'm sorry for murdering that. I don't know how to do that click thing yet. Or Zulu. I have learned so much about South African history that I never managed to capture in the classroom. And I think as we wind up this topic, it makes me not this topic, but this question. I think really the best way indeed for us, for our people to understand anything is through actually art, because art is such a gentle teacher. Art is such an empathetic teacher. And I'm really glad that we're having this conversation. I hope that we can have some kind of documentation out of it. So I want us to go to the next question, which is the second last question. And it is that cultural activism has been used by Pan-African liberation movements to raise critical consciousness, educate, and coordinate resistance. What are the ways in which we remain connected to this ethos and use culture as a tool for decolonial feminist liberation in the current realities of neocolonization? So please, if you feel like you want to jump onto this, because I don't want to use the order of Sunshine and Nombuso, you can just, talk about it, share your thoughts about this question.
Okay, I'm gonna try to keep this one like a little shorter. I don't want to like burst a bubble. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have my own very existential feelings about South African protest music. And I'm recognizing the ways in which so many of us have grown up, or like that music helped us grow up, whether some of us were in the student movement, Rhodes Must Fall, etc. And those who are older than my generation who were in the anti-apartheid struggle, and the ways in which the protest songbook of South Africa literally helped us cross many dangerous paths, emotionally, physically, mentally, But at the same time, I'm now sitting in a country that is being ruled by the same liberation movements that sang these songs, the same liberation movements where today they can sit and stand with us and clap hands and sing the very same songs that we are sing them back at us with no fear. They're not at all threatened by the actual practice of that song. Has made me realize how culture is up for grabs. Anyone can have it. The product of the even protest music itself doesn't belong to the creators of it. It doesn't belong to the left ethic. It can be used by anyone. Nothing for me is more demobilizing than seeing our president, who's a billionaire, who used to be a trade unionist fighting for workers in the 80s, who is now at the center, one of the biggest problems for workers in this country, singing worker songs and clapping his hands and dancing. There's something about how a Black liberation movement that is now government, how they've been at the center of completely demobilizing the protest culture and the practice of protest song in this country. I'm still sitting with that, and Omolara, it's infuriating. It's very demobilizing. What happens when song can be mobilized, when the state can harmonize with you, I remember this thing that, Harmony Holiday talks about, that what happens when the state can harmonize and sing along with you, if you're saying, oh, we want the land back, and the state can sing with you and say, yeah, we want the land back, and clap. I don't have the English for it, but it makes me feel, it makes me speechless. Like, I become very quiet when I think about that. Just quickly answering the question, the question that you asked. For me, I think part of it is us having to really rethink what the questions are for our time. These liberation movements, these African liberation movements that we're using, cultural activism to raise critical consciousness and educate and coordinate resistance. They were responding to particular questions. They were responding to a very specific understanding of what the world that they are fighting for needs to look like. And I'm starting to feel, just from being in this country, being in this continent, that we have very different questions now to these liberation movements, because some of these liberation movements are our biggest problems today. Specifically, I mean, if you're in this region, it's SWAPO is your problem, ZANU-PF is your problem, the ANC is your problem, Frelimo is your problem, These are the same liberation movements that construct these ideas around culture, and they use culture to respond to their questions. Some of their questions were about, how do we destroy the colonial state? How to keep a revolutionary ethic in a post-independence state. But these are the same people who have failed to answer their own questions. Their answers are not giving them the answers that they have right now are not the sort of answers that they were fighting for when they were struggling for liberation. So for me, what I take from them is not to say that everything was a complete failure, but how can we ask new questions and make sure that our ideas around cultural activism are mobilizing for the sort of answers that we want. So for me, the answer to that question begins with us saying that, yes, we can stay connected, right? We can stay connected to the ethos of cultural activism as a practice. But what do we actually want? When we think of a new world, a new continent, what do we want? We know what certain groups of people wanted, what the Marxists wanted, at the time, what, the Fanonians wanted, a particular formula to the destruction of the colonial state. The Marxists and the socialists had their own revolution that leads to socialism. Those things right now, those questions, I'm not sure if those questions are relevant for the world that we live in today. And that's not to say that they were not relevant then, because had they not happened, we wouldn't even know we wouldn't have the conversation. So they are openings for us, right? So for me, it's like, what really are the questions of my generation? What should I be answering for? What kind of future am I trying to purchase with my questions today? When I say Mia, it's a collective question. What are our questions? And once those questions become clear, the role of cultural activism then becomes even clear. And what are our questions? That's another that's another question that I can't answer. But part of the questions right now is that Or rather, part of answering that, Omolara, is to say that I know what the questions are not, which is not good enough, but it's a start. I know what the questions are not. The questions are not the same formula that our parents organized to answer their context, which were very fair, very fundamentally fair questions and ways of organizing. It's not to bash the older generation, because we wouldn't be even having these conversations had it not been for the kinds of things that they activated. We're here because of those activations. But what is it about our current situation, living in a neoliberal state, global state, machinery of neoliberalism, this multifaceted machinery of capitalism that has completely eroded every line of contact amongst us as Africans? How do we, like, what are the questions for us? Because now you can't liberate South Africa alone and think you're going to have a socialist state alone in South Africa and you're going to live this revolutionary life. The rest of the continent is not in that situation. Or you think you're going to have an island and of a continent that is absolutely anti-capitalist and anti-this, yet the rest of the world is not. So I think, Omolara, maybe part of like just closing off with that is that we need to maybe look at what are our symptoms? What are the things that we are experiencing? Now we live in a very globalized community. That's one thing I can say. We live in a sort of like vortex and world that we can't answer our questions without each other. We've always known that in this continent. We've had Pan-Africanism, whether it worked or not, it taught us that thing, that we need to stay together to survive. But now we're also realizing that there's a whole global community that we need to also engage in defining what the questions are for us today. And then through that, then the questions of how cultural activism, the ethos of it gets mobilized, it gets answered in those sort of questions and answer processes. Yeah.
Wow, Nombuso. You have posed many questions, but I think they're really important questions in leading us to the kinds of answers that we are looking for. Thank you for bringing forward that, quote around what happens when the state harmonizes with you. It reminds me of something that feminists have written somewhere, like on Twitter, that if they ever write something and a man is agreeing with them, they'll like double check and see whether they have, said the right thing. And I think the question that I'm going to carry into the discussion from the questions you've posed to us is indeed what happens when, the old song is now a fave, a lullaby for your oppressor. Do you change the song? Do you stop singing? Do you abandon that cause? What do we do with the songs that have now become our oppressors' favorites that they sing with us? I think it's something we can all answer together. But I feel that you do actually give a kind of light into where we could go, because you talk about sitting down and finding out the questions of our time. And for me, I can see that that is a path towards our authentic, finding an authentic cause that directly addresses the kind of system, because the systems have morphed since our parents. That is why, indeed, when you mention that the former liberators are now in power, even in Uganda, the NRM is currently in power, and our president comes from, at some point, a Marxist socialist tradition. So there is that. So indeed, it's really, really strange. And indeed, finding out the questions, I think, is something we must do so that it can inform our art, our songs, our drawings, our writing, so that we don't end up singing old songs for old systems that have changed. That is not the face. The face of the system has changed, and so the song doesn't even affect the people we are singing it for or towards. So thank you so much. Sunshine, do you have something that you would like to contribute? to this question?
Yeah, maybe not the question directly,
Yeah.
because I feel like Nombuso has thoroughly talked about that question. I was thinking about my own boredom as an organizer and as an activist with policy briefs. I mean, people who work in NGOs and non-profits, there's policy briefs and empty strategies and twirling for promises, for empty promises from morally bankrupt politicians in conference rooms with bad lighting and terrible pastries during break. And to think that what has our organizing, or what the revolution has been reduced to. And we can't separate this conversation about that ethos, that cultural organizing from the political economy. Something that Nombuso touched on when they were speaking. They were talking about neoliberalism and how we find ourselves in almost, on one hand, there is the global North imperial capitalism by the World Bank and the IMF, in complicity with our governments, the ones that used to sing liberation songs with us and promise liberation. And we have the hoodwinking of states, for example, to cut resourcing to public services, education being one of them, and the arts as well being one of them, in favor of allowing the market to do whatever the capitalists have designed the market to do, which is continuously oppress and keep us working, in these conference rooms with bad lighting and terrible pastries. But also to so two things about that. We have to rethink or evolve our thinking around our own organizing, but we also have to support the artists that are thinking and already dreaming for us about what the revolution looks like. I know, for instance, when the conversations around genocide have been emerging, there's a collective of artists in Uganda, 32 Degrees East, that had put together teaching series to just raise political consciousness. Mike, okay. To raise political consciousness and teach us about what is happening to Palestine and how that is connected to Congo and how that is connected to us in Uganda. And I have seen, this artist in Kenya who has done, I forget her name, I'll find it and add it in the chat, who has done a really a good job of illustrating the faceless women of the Mau Mau rebellion, and continuing to bring in conversations that women have been organizing and continue to organize, liberation, for our liberation, for our collective freedom. I think some of the questions that Nombuso is talking about is how do we then bring together our plural or our multiple ways of organizing and connect them to, this globalization and this neoliberalism and this neo-colonialism that continues to surface in multiple ways. One of those things being the absence or the English is finished, it's 5 p.m. in Uganda, but but one of those things really being for us to reflect on how we can continue to organize outside of the systems. There is a feminist writer, Akujo, who writes about, fugitive feminism, about embracing the status of fugitivity as an aspect to determine our own liberation, to determine our own salvation, if for lack of a better word, from these systems of oppression. So I have many thoughts and many reflections, but I think we cannot separate what is happening to our arts and our artists and our inability to create and consume art in ways that are not capitalist from really the boot of neoliberalism that is in complicity with our governments. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sunshine, for really highlighting this system and how, we must think outside of it in order to create any kind of art that accomplishes what our ancestors were able to accomplish. I think let me reserve what I want to say for after we complete this question so that we can discuss it in the open discussion. I hope there are some artists and like some on this call. I hope there are people who are like curators and painters, because that's a question to them. So let's get into the next question, which is also the last question. How do you envision the role of artists and archivists, musicians, writers, poets, etc. in shaping new worlds? What contextually relevant elements are needed to create spaces that foster feminist Pan-African liberation? Before you guys get in, I think Sunshine, you have pretty much kind of scratched the surface of this question on the role of artists in envisioning a new world, and where you talk about how they need to imagine outside of the current neoliberal system. So I feel like you should ride that thought and continue with what cultural elements or what relevant elements do you think need to happen for our context in order to make the art space produce for the feminist liberation, for the Pan-African liberation?
Okay. I have a good example that I wanted to bring. So first of all, this conversation is needed, and many of these conversations are needed. And I think for many of us who have had the misfortune or the fortune of organizing within institutions that are supposed to be for our liberation, we have seen the pushback and the refusal to include art and artists, especially within how we think. And again, I can't not say this, we can't separate how we organize from where our resources come from. People who want log frames and reports that look like, really boring outcome and strategic things. But that's not to say there are no other ways of organizing that have been happening. I have the example that I wanted to bring was at the last gathering of the Uganda Feminist Forum. I don't remember what year it was, but I think it was somewhere in the pandemic years. We had this Ugandan artist, actually kudos to Leah, who is on this call, who was part of the people who are organizing the Uganda Feminist Forum, who brought a Ugandan artist, Pamela Enyonu, I hope that's how they pronounce her name, to essentially to listen to our conversations, because we are dreaming about what we want for the feminist movement to look like in the next, I think, 10 years, and looking back on what the feminist movement looked like, I think, in 2010, and to create a mural of our dreams and our conversations and the things that were coming up during that. And I felt that was one of the things that's like, this is so amazing, and also a way to not just bring art into our liberation conversations, but also to allow and create space for artists that I feel many times are, again, back to the conversation around education and the colonial erasure of our education systems, are consistently like frowned upon. So I felt like that was one of the, I feel like that's what is one of the ways that we can continue to think about doing this work, to support artists, to pay artists, to feed artists. Artists need food and wine, and also to not think about our organizing as separate from the artists, but as part of, as part of our resistance, our collaborative work of liberation. I've been thinking about our theme of the year this year, Visible Wiki Women, which is Our Resistance is Plural, Feminist Liberation, Solidarity, and Peace, which was very much informed by the many revolutionary things that are happening by feminists and queer folks across the world. And so I think we have to think about how to create space that we have really shrunk, or capitalism has forced us to shrink, or neoliberal NGOization of organizing has caused us to shrink for artists. And you all need to write. I mean, I'm also speaking to myself, but we need writers to keep writing, and we need to find resources to support writers to keep writing, and also orality, and just really archiving all the stories that we hold. I feel like an activist again, just by making this, so I'm going to stop talking now.
Thank you, Sunshine. I feel you 1,000% on everything you said. When I think of the work that I like, even to say work, I'm like two ways about it, but the ways in which I participate in feminist movements or feminist organizations in this continent, trying to think with sound and music as a contribution to how we think about our struggles and how we organize. I'm constantly having to justify what this art thing that you're doing is, how this art thing that you're doing is going to lead to like the change happening in this particular place. And I think part of what I'm trying to add to this is that we need to really reassess the role of practitioners, arts practitioners, writers, archivists, musicians, and unlearn a few things. It's been very anxiety-inducing to walk into, let's say, a feminist circle organized by an organization that is funded to work around issues related to gender in Africa. And then you come into that space as a practitioner, and you present and you activate the space through art. And then the thing that you get asked is, what is the relevance of this with us moving from A to B? And that's happened to me so many times in ways that it doesn't happen in other spaces. But I understand why that happens, is because we've lost the memory of what cultural practice does and what it's supposed to be doing. So I used to get very sad and existential and like feel like I'm crying, I like want to go home and cry. What am I doing? Is it not making sense? And then getting to a point of realizing that actually, no, we need to unlearn a lot of things. We need to unlearn how we perceive art practice. We have to unlearn our relationship to artists. And part of that is to see the work of artists as labor itself. That's why for me, when the Medu Art Ensemble artists used to call themselves cultural workers, I took that on because I'm like, no, those people were very clear that what I'm doing is making a poster is no different from someone who is you know, building a road for the movement or building a bridge. This is labor. And it's a two-way thing. It's a way of also kind of demobilizing the self-importance of artists, that they are the most special people in the room, but at the same time, also amplifying the work that we do as work that is part of the process of us getting to the world that we want. It's not an addition, it's not a supplementary thing. You know, it's not a side, you know, like English is escaping me, but there's a word where something is just hanging on, you know, it's not an accessory, that's the word. It's not an accessory. It's part and parcel of how we think of like the new world. So I think for me, it's also just about unlearning. We need to unlearn like a lot of ways in which a lot of us, including myself, I've thought about art practice in very limiting ways, until I started getting involved in it and learning from others, and then realizing, oh, okay, like, yeah, let me stop there.
I will not let you stop there yet, Nombuso, because I want you to just give some examples. Like what you said is very interesting, and I'm trying to make also sense of it, and for the purpose of all of us. Can you give some examples of what people think, the current understanding of, like, what's the current relationship of people to artists that you're talking about? What do you think? What are, like, just like three things, like briefly, because at okay, on my end it's 5:30. It will be 5:30, and when it's 5:30, I want us to open the discussion. But I want you to just finish that thought and tell us what people expect from artists. What do they wrongly expect from artists, and what should they expect? If you have those
Sure.
responses now, if you don't, we
Um,
can discuss them later. Yeah.
Sometimes it's this thing where it's like, let me give an example. Like sometimes what I do is that I do these sound sessions where I use like audio material, interviews, field recordings, music, recorded text, and I'm invited into feminist spaces to basically like host these sound sessions around like feminist histories, but through sound. So I'm not specifically talking about a particular movement, but I'm using the archives of women who were part of those movements to bring that conversation to the fore. And sometimes what happens, and I totally get where that urgency is coming from. It's a very material urgency. And the like the response at times might be from organizers that, okay, we get this thing. This was like really incredible. It opened our minds up in a particular way. But we're just trying to figure out how does like this, the use of sound in this specific way, like lead us to making sure that we get housing that the state promised us 2 years ago, right? Those are very fair like moves. And in fact, I'm sometimes when they do come up, I'm like, that's exactly a great question, because this particular moment has opened up, you've opened up a question for me to, you've invited me to show you how this kind of work can, in the most like mental sense, help you think through the archive of resistance that is embodied and that you already know and have inside of you, right? So like for me, those are like the examples. Those are like the best case scenarios. And then we have examples where you are invited by funder organizations that fund feminist movements. And then they want to know, okay, when we write our funding proposal, our funding report, like our report to our funders, how is this thing that you're doing like materially, like what are the outputs of it for that movement? And I'm always, I get for those sides for that side of of my experiences, that's a side that I often get very short with, because I'm like, one, that's not a question for you to answer. That's a question for organizers and movements to answer. And that's not a question for me to answer, number two. Number three, I don't do this work to produce answers for funders. And I think a lot of artists are finding themselves in these situations where they are trying to work outside, or not even outside, because we are all inside of it, but to work on the margins of capitalism through artistic practice. They are always being forced to respond back to capitalism in particular ways. Now I must write and show you how a particular sound session or doing audio archival work is going to change A, B, and C. And you know that that answer is an impossible answer. It's an impossible question to answer because it's a political question. How this and that changes is produced by, like, it's a historical question. It's produced by people organizing and people being in the process of organizing and activism. And what I'm doing is part of the process. It's not the most important thing. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that you have funders, feminist funders in particular, who are funding artists to respond to this particular arena, who are wanting artists to respond to very specific political economy questions, where they equate cultural practice and political economy as if those things are the same thing. And for me, I always struggle with that. I'm like, culture is not more important than political economy. Culture reinvigorates political economy. So you can't ask me as a cultural practitioner, or a cultural practitioner who works in a collective of other practitioners who are thinking in anti-capitalist ways, to answer material political questions through art practice. What we can do is to kind of like to support that base, to bring form to it through these ethics of a cultural ethic and background that we have. But we're not going to be able to answer, like, when, I don't know, like when is Ruto going to be removed? Artists can't give you that answer. They can't. But they can give you the energy of that of like that question, what that question means to people. They can give you the energy of it, but they're not going to tell you that, okay, this guy's gonna be out of office on it by the end of the year. They can't answer those political questions. I hope that makes sense.
Oh yeah, you make a lot of sense. Um, and as you spoke so passionately about it, it made me really sad because of how a process, of course, like art, that was supposed to be something organic, something that takes its own time, like it works on its own time, it operates in its own time. Like the practice, I think, of building uh contributing to our people's collective subconscious is not done within the quarter of a year, or like within whatever period you want it to happen. It is all our subconscious and our collective subconscious were built over time through generations, from like different things, through things we did not even notice were happening. And what the artists, we want them to do is to contribute positively to that, or like help us resolve some of our things. But of course, it's not the kind of work that can happen within a week. And this art installation has suddenly sparked the revolution that upsets the system. It may remove somebody, but the system stays. And I think you've really emphasized very well. You've been very clear in emphasizing how artists have been roped into the transactional nature of our existence, whereby it's like we are back in, this is one large cotton shamba, and we are all being asked for our quota at the end of the day. Give me your bag of cotton, give me your bag of coffee, give me your sugar cane, where is your cocoa, where is your everybody, even those who do not necessarily want to be a part of that, or even whose work does not relate directly. So I'm really sorry about that, but I've understood it clearly. I don't know if Sunshine, you want to say anything at this point. If you have something, you can contribute to it. Otherwise, I think we have 30 minutes remaining. and it would be a great time right now to open the discussion up to anybody who wants to share about some of the things that our speakers have been talking about. And to just start us off, of course, you can choose to digress and talk about what you want to talk about, but just there's some questions that I was writing down as our speakers were presenting. And the first question is, what do we do with language? Uh, what do we do with this question of language or producing art through our language? Should we stick to the our African languages, and then that covers a small, like the best that it covers? Will this movement be built over time? Will liberation come over time, or should we use the colonial languages? Another question is the misuse of art or the reclamation of art. I don't even know what reclamation is, too soft a word. Let me let me try to find something to capture. I think what um you were talking about, the speakers were talking about, the when our oppressors basically, I guess, occupy our art and our mediums of art, when they start singing and harmonizing with us during the revolutions, what do we do? Do we change the mediums of art? Do we change the art? What do we do with that? What are your thoughts? And then the last one is, I think, to try and answer some of the questions that were also posed by um, also during the discussion. What can we do? Which is like the last question. What can we do? What changes can we make to return to that place where art is working for us and for our liberation and the concerns of our time? Personally, for me, when I was hearing you, let me go first, is when I was hearing all of you and Nombuso and Sunshine, you talked about, of course, the system, and how, we do everything to appeal to the neoliberal gaze. And for me, my first input is to turn our gaze away, to find a way to turn our gaze away from these systems and bring them back home, to turn away our gaze from the funds, from the, I don't know, even the superficial problems that are propped up as our problems, when our problems are systemic. But I don't know what other people think. So if you want to say something, just raise your hand or just unmute yourself. Actually, unmute yourself and speak. Friend, can I see can I hear some voices?
Hi. Hi, everyone. My name is
Hi.
Susan.
Hey,
Thank you so
Susan.
much for giving us a platform to discuss very essential things. I think it was Sunshine who was talking, and she mentioned, the fact that capitalism has its knee on the neck of, art and creative expression. But also from the conversations, they just got me thinking, yes, we have the collective responsibility, but also there's something that we can do as individuals within our everyday lives. And I like to believe that the best audience and most accessible audience we have is each other. So, for example, when it comes to things like language, the children that we are raising and the conversations that we're having, how do we seize every opportunity to continuously engage in our local dialects, right? Because, there are instances where you can speak English. Yes, you learned the language, but then without practice, it sort of disappears. But also it got me thinking, like in my personal life, I always defend with every breath my creative expression, despite the fact that I have a capitalistic job, right? So I hold on to every creative artistic expression that I have. I feel like for me to even survive at my job, I need that outlet. I need that space to be able to create, right? And I have a lot of artistic friends, and I see how like the struggle is real, like, you know, keeping art alive versus surviving, right? And also how like now every artistic experience has been commercialized, whether it's a painting experience, whether it's, I think it's art shows mostly that are free entry. But then again, how do those guys survive? Because to keep the art alive and to keep creating, there's livelihoods to keep. So yeah, this conversation just got me thinking about all of those things, and especially how we can individually contribute as the collective continuously gets organized. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us the best audience with each other. Indeed, I guess instead of trying to speak to the entire continent, we should just talk to each other and then build fast, like with it. And I guess these movements will find a way to sync with other people, and that will even preserve our own, like, mediums of communication and our languages, which are really important. Thank you so much for your contribution. Does anybody else have something to say? I will read in the meantime. If somebody unmute and just speak, but as you clear your vocal cords, I'll read Esther Penn's message. Thank you to the panelists. Everything both of you spoke about really resonated. You have given us a lot to think about in this conversation. The session was wonderfully moderated. Thank you. A queer feminist organizer from India. Thank you so much, Esther Penn. It's good to see you here. Interesting, because I've been reading a book where your name is one of the characters' names. So I hope I pronounced it well. And then Suleiman Lucia said, I love that, Susan. Assume we're the best audience with each other. Yeah. So does anybody else have anything to say? Any responses to the
Yes.
question? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Zina. I'm from South Africa. I am like a co-organizer of the Queer Feminist Film Festival that's in South Africa. And like everything that both Nombuso and Sunshine has spoken about just resonates. I found myself laughing out loud and also just like wanting to hug and cry at the same time. There's like three things that come up, or a few things that come up for me from this conversation. And one is just like the stark realization that this colonial project that is kind of like a disease and a germ. It morphs itself, right? It starts as like a bacteria, and then we develop an antibiotic, and then it somewhere like morphs itself into a virus, and like it can shapeshift. And the ways that it keeps us so distracted, that became such a strong realization again for me in this conversation, because the distraction keeps us from then being able to imagine and dream. It keeps us distracted in terms of the work that we have to do with ourselves and each other. And it keeps us busy, this thing of being busy. So that really came through for me today. And another thing that I'm also thinking about and that was raised in this conversation, and I'm really, really grateful, like genuinely grateful for the wisdoms and the lessons and the provocations that were shared in this space today. I needed this today. So thank you. It brought up this thing around, as activists, as organizers, as Indigenous people, as Black people, as people of color, as people from the continent and diaspora, specific, but yes, how is it that like we are so, yes, we are anti-colonial, yes, we are anti-capitalistic, however, we exist within colonial legacies and a colonial present day. And we also exist within capitalistic systems that we have to pay bills and go to our capitalistic jobs, as another sibling mentioned earlier during the, so how do we also begin to, instead of keeping ourselves busy with the anti, how do we also begin to claim, like, yes, how do we make this thing work and navigate it in a way that is less from a place of, I don't want to be too proximate, or I don't want to be like swallowed by it, if that makes any sense. Like, I'm trying to imagine what could that be, for artists, for curators, for activists, for organizations. But a question for me to the room is, what are the ways that you see intersectional working with art and activism and the state, and like, what does that look like for you? Because a big thing is the siloed ways we organize and the siloed ways we do struggle. It's land and I just do land, or there's another organization that does art and they just do art, and very seldom do we collaborate and or think together and or call each other in. So I'm just wondering, like, what are your thoughts about intersectional ways that arts and culture can be used to rather bring together? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Zena, for your beautiful questions. When you asked a question on how can we move away from what I would interpret as being reacting, like continuously being in a state of reaction to colonialism, and then going to a state where we are creating for ourselves without necessarily just fighting, like, or creating out of conflict against the establishment. I hope I've understood your question well. And also, what are the intersectional ways that we can organize? I'll of course put those questions back to everybody, including the speakers. Nombuso, do you want to have a go at it? Sunshine, do you want to have a go at it? Does anybody in the audience want to have a go at it to answer Zena's questions? Please unmute yourself. Hey, wait, it's cricket in here. Friend, I'm about to start calling out some familiar people I see in this crowd. So unmute yourself before I do that.
Hi, hello everyone. This is Omolara, and yeah, thank you so much. I was reflecting just now, and even though we sort of designed this series, I don't think I was ready for the I don't think I was ready for the analysis and the spirit, of this conversation. I don't think I could have prepared for that, and I'm so grateful to our speakers for that. I'm so amazed and blessed. I feel fired up, and at the same time, I feel like there's just room for collective despair and hope and all of that, and it's so beautiful to witness. To think about Zina's question on how we can organize intersectionally. It was Audre Lorde who shared that we don't live single issue lives. And coloniality loves the binary, it loves a this or that experience. And we all know that we don't live a this or that life. We know that there are nuances and layers and like different kind of like sides to the lives that we live. But then we live in a colonial world that basically designs everything, including our resistance, you know? That takes us to the question of how can we quit reacting and build? You only quit reacting if the foot is off your neck, but the foot is not off our necks. And so the question around how do we stop reacting always leads me to that place where I'm thinking, you know, reaction is not bad in itself. However, it's important for us to create room, you know, room to build. But how do we build under the current circumstances? Those are the questions, right? But the question around intersectional building is that we live in a world where our nuanced identities are erased and we are replaced with this binary thinking of this or that. And so it's only normal for our work to take that line. And I always say that one of the things that we can do to go back to or embrace intersectional organizing is to reject the coloniality of the mind that puts us in a place where it's either this or that, and start to chart, you know, a liberatory course for ourselves that reflects our desires and feelings and learnings from our ancestors and all of that good stuff. And how do we do that? And I'm going to just tell maybe a small story of Liberation Alliance. For example, we don't organize around a particular issue. We organize a decolonial feminist front. And that means that today we will organize around art, and tomorrow we will organize around knowledge systems, and next week we will organize around, you know, whatever it is that falls, that allows us to advance a decolonial future is what we will organize around, is what we will talk about, is what we will live and breathe and ask our friends to come join us and all of that good stuff. And so we have to just follow the work of Sylvia Tamale, who reminds us all the time that the work of coloniality is to keep us in that siloed place where we are now obsessing over one thing, whereas we are multiple things, we are multitudes, and we just need to, you know, it's really crazy. When I say these things, sometimes I feel really like bad, because I then start to think about it like, oh, you know, on some level right now on the continent, even the idea of rerouting oneself in the truth of what anti-colonial feelings and imaginations look like can be privilege, because it means that you have been able to kind of take yourself away from the struggles and ask the deeper questions and explore, you know, the deeper permutations around life. I don't even know if I'm making any sense, but I'm just trying to reflect around how intersectional organizing is not something that we just come by. It's something that we intentionally build, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is painful, even when it is enjoyable, because it's not only about pain, yeah? So it's intentional creation of spaces that on a granular level rejects colonial ideations around who we are and what we are. And really sometimes it might include kind of, you know, being at odds with donors, which is one thing I know is not easy, yeah? You know, it might be that because, oh, we want to fund some work around this. How about we fund the work that makes us happy? How about you fund the work that speaks to our key priorities? And I don't know if Toby is available to share our report on philanthropy, because we did a report on philanthropy last year, and we were talking about the relationship between, you know, donors and the people who are using those resources, and how is there a reality in which he who pays the piper does not dictate the tune? And what does that reality look like, you know? And so, Zina, these are the reflections, and I do believe that we are in these spaces consistently having these conversations and just trying to figure out what the future looks like. And like Nombuso said earlier, and that's my new question of obsession. What are the questions? Now I must think about what the questions are. And I do believe that this might be one of the questions, Nombuso also said something around how organizing for us may not look like what it was, because now we have to organize in a globalist world where, where we kind of are forced to live the same realities, even though the ingredients are different, So these are kind of the reflections. Thank you.
Thank you, Omolara, for that, for attempting to delve into a really complex question. I can see a hand from Esther Penn. Esther Penn, you can speak.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to apologize if I'm speaking out of turn. I don't live in the context, but I just wanted to echo what Omolara was saying and add to the fact that like the work of coloniality is also to tell us that we are one thing, that we are either activists or we are artists or we are, sort of we work in tech or we work in a specific space, and we can only reflect on life and activism and what colonizes us from our perspective, whereas the truth is that we're all actually creators, we're all artists, in a way, and we're all organizers. I mean, from the India context, one of the things that the state started doing was telling students, telling teachers, and like making sure that students, teachers, particularly artists, don't think of themselves as part of the labor force, right? What I think Sunshine was also speaking about, or I think and 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 that's how they weaken the labor movement here in India, specifically by taking out one by one people, the fallacy that colonialism tells you that, okay, now you are middle class, now you're not a part of a community that organizes for housing rights or a community that organizes against poverty. So just wanted to add that I think one of the ways is to also recognize our potential and the multiplicities that are implicit in who we are, and try to actualize that and bring that to our work, bring our artistic potential, bring our organizing potential, bring our understanding of science and logics and math, and not be intimidated by the fact that oh, I should not be commenting on how fundraising is done because I work in programs, but or I should not be commenting on how artists and art is conducted or how artivism takes place because I cannot paint or I cannot sing or I cannot, but we are constantly creating art by way of living. We're constantly creating art by way of telling our stories. So I just wanted to add to that. Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful session.
Oh, thank you, Esther Penn. And oh, you said something in the chat about your name being from The God of Small Things, and that's the book that I was reading. But thank you so much for what you have said. And it really comes back, I think, to the fact that in a neoliberal capitalist world, we are forced to be like to specialize so that we can, I don't know, become like some perfect machines that deliver a specific thing. Like we all have our stations and we're not supposed to move from those stations. So I think you're talking about that, and it's a great reminder to us indeed to recognize our multiplicity and to know that we are creatives and creators, even as we have these other titles out here in the assembly line. So because we have a few minutes, I think let's just get some parting shots. I can't remember what phrase. Oh my god, they got me. But anyway, some last words, but like yeah, from our speakers, you want to say anything? Sunshine, Nombuso, just briefly, and then we close off nicely. What do you want to leave with the people, the masses?
feel like we're both waiting for the event to start.
Okay, let me choose. The one who spoke last should, no, who spoke, who has not spoken in a while, should go first. Sunshine, it was you.
Oh,
Go.
okay, nice.
Yeah.
Also, there's no question. We're just saying our.
No, just no question. We have
Okay,
2 minutes. Yeah.
great. I can speak in 2 minutes. I
In 1 minute.
wanted to
for you.
reflect on the question that Tenda spoke about, the ways around intersectional working, and again, it's almost 6 p.m. My English is finished, but I have been thinking about this in the context of queer organizing, especially in this country that continues to, where the state continues to sanction violence against queer folks, but also not just the state sanctioned violence, also the violence within like organizing institutions that are funded by colonial institutions, telling people what to do and how to organize. I'm not going to shame anyone. I like to shame some funders, but I won't do that on this call. And I was thinking that one of my favorite organizers in this country are queer organizers and also sex work organizers who have built care within how they organize, but also built intersectionality. And in a context like Uganda, it's hard to think about where intersectionality can thrive without also causing harm or exposing people to harm. But I really just wanted to vocalize all the amazing ways that Ugandan queer folks have been organizing, have been creating art, have been dancing, creating TikTok videos, creating jewelry, just really existing in a context that refuses to acknowledge that. And maybe we can learn and continue to create space. So for those of us who have the opportunities to organize spaces or to support art and artists, to always ask, where are the queer artists in this space, where are the sex worker, as where are the people that are on the margins of organizing, and also to continue to push back funders telling us what to do about our bodies and our organizing. And that can look sometimes like refusing to take money if you have the privilege to do that, or taking the money and just doing what you want with it. But anyway, like I don't know which artist says Eribuzo Binji answer Antono. Too many questions, not enough answers, not on this call, not by a long shot, but I'm really glad to have been asked to speak. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sunshine, for that. Nombuso, 1 minute.
I don't really have like closing remarks, because I think what I can say, the closing remark for me is that this conversation has left me with more questions and maybe more openings about the place of cultural activism and practice as we try to figure out the present, as we try to figure out our relationship to the past in the present, and what kind of future that we want to see. And I always insist that for me and for a lot of people, what I've learned is that the future is right now. The future is only ever going to be in what we're in right now, in the present. And how are we moving closer to that realization that as living human beings, the future is only ever in the present. And there's that urgency that each generation has, Yeah. And I think maybe the last thing is that, yes, there are artists and there are cultural practitioners in the sense that, you know, some of us do this work for our livelihood. But part of the new moral vision for us is to return to a place where every single human being sees themselves as a you know, a practitioner or someone who's inside the practice of culture and art. So our sibling in India, I completely agree with that perspective. I think we need to kind of co-own, and we need to really dismantle the ownership around arts and cultural practice. Who gets to define that, while at the same time obviously protecting those people whose livelihoods are directly affected by the existence of arts and culture as practices, as disciplines, as areas that funders fund, you know, and university support and institution support. Yeah.
Wow, Nombuso, thank you so much for those remarks. And I think because of time, at least I feel like my work is done on this call. Maybe Toby, I think you can take over now and, you know, send us off.
Thank you, Mubeezi. Thank you, everyone. Nombuso, Sunshine, and everyone that has stayed up until this moment. It has been an interesting conversation. And it doesn't end here. We are going to continue the We Speak of New Things series. Please stay connected with us as we share updates of upcoming themes and other sessions. Omolara, do you want to say anything before we close?
Yeah, quickly, just to share that we're going through a series of sessions that we have titled We Speak of New Things. And it is just the framing of our liberatory path as we go forward. And we want to encourage you to please join us for the other 4 parts within this series. And we're looking forward to just kind of joining with you and sharing with you as we go along. Thank you so much. That's all from me, Toby.
Thanks, Omolara. Thanks, everyone, once again. Please stay connected, as we've mentioned, on our socials. Our speakers are also on social media. You can stay connected with them to see updates on what they are doing, on very many interesting radical feminist things that they are working on. You can also follow them and stay connected with them. Thank you, everyone that has joined. If you want to follow up with questions, reflections, you can write to us on any of our social media platforms or send us an email. Thank you, everyone. We will share the recording when it's ready. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day, your evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.